The night was deep, and he was walking in the darkness inside a forest towards the sea. Normally, he would have had in mind to use the coastal path to go where he was heading to, but he did not want anyone to see him that night, and he knew that the pub would be full of drunkards and slow-witted fools who drank their nights away with cards and women. Basically, he would have been there himself. That's where he spent most of his evenings after the endlessly tiring days at sea. But it was already 2 straight nights that he had not gone to the pub, and just as many mornings that he had not appeared for work at the fish-hauling seep. After he had woken up that same morning, numbed as he was by the humidity of his room, and after he had washed his face with some water, he had lain in his bed again and had been looking at the white ceiling. He was having a hard time focusing. Was it all real, what he had seen? Was sea real? He had not dared to go to the same place again, the immediately previous night, but he was thinking that he should go at some point. It was impossible to get her out of his mind, but the truth was that he hadn't really tried. During the fever of those last couple of days, he was thinking of nothing other than her, and the possibility of the stories his grandfathers and grandmothers were telling him in front of the fireplace back when he was young in the endless nights of winter, and which he absorbed like a soap, were real. He'd hid behind the trees when he heard voices from the coastal road, and was walking as quickly and silently as he could. He passed a little further down from the pub, a street away, and thankfully he did not meet someone he knew. It was a cold night for their season, but that did not prevent the local bearded sailors to sing and dance all together, with glasses full of beer and whiskey, those sometimes brazen and sometimes funny sip songs of theirs. And the truth is that 2 nights ago he had drunk a lot, and perhaps too much at that. He had gone out to get some air and walk for a little while, just enough to not faint because of the bad stench of the pub. The place was small, and very soon the atmosphere was becoming unbearable due to the smoke from the cigarettes, the sweat, and the rest of the patrons' body odors. The fact that a thin wooden door separated the toilet from the hall did not help the situation. Sometimes, when he came out and breathed the clean sea wind, he was wondering how everyone else in there could stand it. This is what had happened to him on that night as well, with the cold of the night pinching his sides and freezing the sweat on his forehead. He had walked west, along the shore, distancing himself from the songs and the merry mood, throwing his own now empty bottle of whiskey in the sand, disgusted with himself, with his life, with everything. He had drunk too much. He went to the small natural cove almost half a kilometre from the pub, where a jetty was as well, made from stones and rocks, extending for almost 200 metres into the sea. The cove and the jetty were not being used for 2 generations now, from the moment that the new harbour had been built on the other side of the village, but the old sailors who were now dead were using that area to tie and repair their boats whenever they needed to. Nowadays, however, the cove and its jetty were a simple attraction of the village, a small summer beach for the citizens and the tourists descending from the city on the weekends. The children of the village were also using the jetty to jump and dive, as at the end of the cove the sea was very deep. He had then been overcome by the strange desire to walk the small jetty until its edge, its furthest point, as he remembered that even himself as a child had dove there. But first he had walked a little further away and had relieved himself in the sand, moaning. Just a little longer, and he would have burst. After tying his pants again, he had walked carefully on the rocks to the edge of the jetty, gazing at the small silver waves to his right and left and the full moon in the sky. Just like tonight, too, the moon was still full, but he was sober and walked to the end of the jetty, wondering for once more on that day if the stories about the ferry taken, the enchanted in the countryside spirits of the grandparents told their grandchildren at night in the form of stories, contained even a small sliver of truth. A real event or incident that differed quite a lot from the eventual story that would be transferred to children, and which had changed as generations passed, infused with more details, had become scarier and easier to remember, to pass on a moral lesson to whoever listened to it. Drunk as he was 2 nights ago, he had removed his shoes and had sat at the edge of the quay, in a natural seat of a rock that allowed him to dip his feet in the cold water and gaze at the waves, the reflection of the moonlight on them, the cold sea breeze. It was a wonderful scene and moment, an experience of utter solitude but also of inward calmness that all of us need every so often. He did the same this night too, sober this time, and with his senses heightened, trying to catch a strange sound in the waves, a shadow, 2 light blue crystals that would gleam in the darkness of the sea. 2 nights ago, with his mind still tied to a knot by the drink, He was thinking about the tide that had come in earlier and all this strange mechanism that brings the shore waters higher or lower depending on where the sun and the moon are. He decided that it was surely something extremely incomprehensible, especially for him at that moment, but the universe and nature had their ways and he, a mere mortal, could not possibly understand, so he perhaps did not have to bother his mind too much about all this. And so, unconcerned as he was, he sat and waited for time to go by and to feel better, for the cold water to help him wake up, and to then leave for home. The sounds from the pub could still be faintly heard, but he was not planning to go back there on that night. Or perhaps he could pass by on the way home to have a final drink just so he would not have to go to bed with a dry throat. He could think about it on the way back. She had been watching him for some time sitting on his own there, on the rocks. As the minutes went by, she was moving ever so closer, calmly, without him noticing. Suddenly, and as she was very close, she sank in the water and with a simple movement appeared from the depths of the sea in front of him, next to his feet, and steadied herself with her hands on the rocks he was sitting on, looking him in the eyes, their faces a few centimeters apart, for a few seconds. Cold, dazed, unable to comprehend what had just happened, he was those light blue, innocent eyes of hers, the almost childish eyes of hers, which really did shine. He instinctively drew closer to her and kissed her, without thinking too much about it, and then he pulled her closer to him and let her rest in his embrace. She did not resist. With this kiss still going on, with his mind confused and his senses sluggish by the drink, he could not conceive the absurdity of the scene, and so he let himself go. When the kiss was over, and while he still had her comfortably in his arms, he started observing her smiling, innocent face with the beautiful features, her long black ebony hair, her smiling, shining smile. His eyes continued exploring, lower, coming upon her uncovered breasts. He turned and looked at her, surprised, the beating of his heart more intense. "Where did you come to me from?" he asked her tenderly, but she did not answer. She simply smiled at him brighter, like a child. Innocent eyes. His own eyes went back on her round breasts with a lazy desire to see it all, but with a stimulated curiosity too, and slowly started descending on her body and on all her beautiful curves which shone strangely and in millions of different shades of white and silver inside the water. The drink did not allow him to realize that the small hole for her belly button was not there. Yet when his eyes descended a little further down, they stopped. They were forced to stop. No matter how drunk he was, his eyes would stop right there. His mind would be unable to accept what he was seeing. Scales. He stood there, looking at them, terrified. With the light of the moon he could faintly see that the silver scales were extending down where her legs should have been, disappearing far inside the dark sea. She immediately noticed his surprise, the tensing of his body, the horror that was quickly rising from his insides. Her smile faded. She easily slipped from his embrace and dived in the cold, dark waters again, leaving him there, upset, unable to believe what had just happened. That night, the night he went back, he had sat again on the same rocks, just like 2 nights ago, on the same hour, with his feet dipped in the cold water, waiting for her to appear again, watching as far as his eyesight would allow him in the dark, hoping to see her inside the sea. He was sober this time, and yet nothing happened, not a suspicious splash, nor her gleaming eyes contrasting brightly against the darkness. At one point, about an hour later, he rose, wore his shoes, and stood there on the rocks. I was drunk. The moonlight was shining on the surface of the water and I was hallucinating. Perhaps I even slept for a bit, he decided. He smiled crookedly, as if asking himself how he could have truly believed that something like that had really happened, then turned his back to the dark waters of the cove and noticed the lights of the village and the pub far away. The 2 light blue eyes, sorrowful this time, followed him there, and when he opened the door and disappeared inside the small house with the voices and the songs, they too in turn disappeared inside the darkness of the sea.